when I was doing my biblical studies degree. And specifically like doing like Greek and Hebrew studies, we would have our Greek and Hebrew Bible, and at the bottom of every page, it would talk about the manuscripts that we had available for these certain texts. And there was always 2 or 3 that we had really good versions of that were, the best ones were from like the 9th century AD. That's 900 years after Jesus lived.
Yeah.
So that's a long time.
And I think the oldest known copy of the Gospel of Matthew is from something like the 2nd or 3rd century.
Yeah.
And it's a fragment, like it's a piece.
It's a little piece.
And the fact that it has survived 1900 years is incredible. And that in itself is excellent evidence that this is a very old book that like wasn't just made up by someone in the 6th century, which of course happened. Like people would do that because they want to try to write something that has authority, maybe for good or bad reasons, whatever it was. But yeah, we there's a lot of faith and trust that goes into just receiving the words that are in the text, and we receive that because we not blindly trust, but we trust the tradition that we're given, and we got to engage with something. And it's not our only access to the divine, but it's an important one. That's for sure.
Was that ever challenging for either of you guys when you confronted some of that initial evidence? It throws a lot of things into question too.
Yeah, I wouldn't say, like, for me, maybe it's because of when I became aware of that I didn't feel like it shook the foundations, the so-called foundations of my faith. I just find it more interesting than anything. Like for me, it's, I want to know at least, I want to find out at least what I can, to the best of my ability, know as being like the so-called truth, or the consensus. So like, I find this conversation, this discussion of like the historicity of something to be like quite compelling and interesting to me. So it doesn't at all diminish or change the nature of what we read, kind of how you were saying, like it doesn't have to like impact the teaching or what we take from it, right?
Doesn't have to.
Yeah. I suppose one could let it impact that to an extent. And I think that depends on the individual and how they tend to process information and think. But for myself, I find, if anything, learning about this stuff, this kind of stuff, or, why are there so many different accounts of, the same kind of thing that don't always match up, or, like that to me no longer, I don't feel a need to like explain it away. If anything, it's more like, okay, I can take this for what it is, and my faith doesn't hang on everything being perfect.
Right, which for some people, especially in the strictly Protestant model, the infallibility and inerrancy of Scripture is a big deal.
Yeah.
Maybe for good reason. Honestly, I've never thought too much about it. But when I think about the transcripts, the versions of the Gospels that we have available to us in the form that they are in terms of actual historical documents, when you can clearly see, even in the Bible that we read, that there's some version or form of editing going on, right? Okay, so even the fact that Jesus was very likely, when he was giving the Sermon on the Mount, speaking in Aramaic, and the Gospel of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and all the rest of the books of the New Testament are written in the common Greek dialect, Koine Greek, at the time. So in order to translate that, you have to edit it. You have to change it.
You have to make decisions about.
Someone had to make decisions. And if your answer to that is, well, the Spirit led the decision maker, and so the Spirit did that, Like that is a response. It's not a very compelling one. It's not one that matches my experience. Perhaps it is just a straight up miracle that translation, the way it worked. I have no reason to say it wasn't, but if you're going to say, well, I'm going to downplay that, you have to come up with another answer. And the answer is that we can't really hang our hat too much on inerrancy or infallibility of Scripture. We have to make some allowances for the editing process, the transcription process. So even if it was divinely inspired like that, Matthew's hand was translated it from Aramaic to Greek, and it was a perfect translation. That perfect translation was transcribed over and over and over and over and over again until it finally came to the version that we managed to get, which is centuries later. So we have a real problem with that. Like that's a problem for us.
And we still do that now. Like there's a reason, like how many translations of the Bible do we have today? We still have people making decisions about how we say a certain word, or do we use this pronoun or not, right?
And there's all kinds of examples within the version that we have as established as like the text that we think is the most accurate one in terms of Greek and Hebrew. And we can say, well, we're still translating a language that we know a lot about Koine Greek. We know a lot about how words that should be translated and what they mean. But you still lose. Like there's certain ideas and words within the Greek text, for example, that we just don't have an equivalent in English.
So you're just translating, well, that's the word.
But it's not. It's not the word.
You have to take it at face value.
You have to use a paragraph to actually try to describe what that word is getting at.
Yeah. And
now you have this translation that no one wants to read.
Yeah.
No one can actually follow along with. It's too clunky.
Yeah.
So all that to say, none of those are reasons why I would struggle to think, well, is there even any meaning in this text? Which is a title of an excellent book, critical book on Scripture translation. I think there is, but it's not because of some tradition or path of inerrancy. It just doesn't meet muster for me when it comes down to that. And so I have to be more reliant on the tradition that I receive and the cloud of witnesses around me. And just try to rely on some good sense and some inspiration in the modern day. That's kind of what it comes down to for me. But there are lots of people who really struggle with the origins of like it. I have one friend who kind of started digging down the rabbit hole of the authorship of the Gospels, and it basically destroyed his faith. And I make no judgment about that whatsoever. He's on his path and he has to figure that stuff out. And maybe we all have to, but it can be a real stumbling block for people. Not where I expected this podcast to go.
That was my fault.
We talked about this. Question 2. I haven't talked about manuscripts for a long time. Have you ever seen a Greek Bible with all that? I'll bring it sometime. It's pretty cool. Each manuscript has like a little symbol.
Yeah.
And so you go down below and it's pretty interesting to like see the little notes down there that ascribe like, okay, this word in this manuscript, it's this Greek word.
Yeah.
And in this one, it's this one. And the editors of that text have decided because of the evidence they have, this is the right one.
Yeah.
And they have all kinds of little tricks about how to decide that based on psychological factors of how would people make these mistakes.
Yeah.
What's more likely? It's more likely that a transcriber would like you take the more unusual thing is usually the correct one, because a transcriber would be less likely to insert this unusual word or this unusual concept as opposed to a normal one. That's a huge judgment call. And not only is it huge because you're kind of, well, you have to use like historical psychological criticism because you're trying to get into the head of a 9th century monk or whatever. It's fascinating.
When I was at UVic, I did an English degree.
Right.
And I took a Bible as literature class from the religious studies department because I thought that would be interesting to read the Bible as like a great work of literature. And that was like probably the first time that I was introduced to a lot of these kinds of things.
Well, it's called textual criticism.
Totally.
That's what it's called.
Yeah. And I remember like, not that I was not shaken by it. It was more like, wow, I never knew. But like, I remember the prof talking about how, was Mary actually a virgin or was she just a young woman? Because the word in Greek does not necessarily mean virgin. It might just mean young woman, right? And so I remember that, like, that's something that sticks out to me from that. I just thought that was so interesting.
It's so, yeah, it is. Absolutely.
It never occurred to me at that time, as however old I was, to be like, oh, this should shake the foundations of what I believe. Maybe I should have been, maybe it should have, I don't know. Maybe I was a little naive, but from where I am now, I think I made, to the extent that I made a decision about learning that, I think how I received that information and processed it happened the right way for me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's in all the Gospels. Like some portions are legitimately, like from a literature standpoint, when you compare it to other Greek texts of around the same time, they are legitimately well-written texts. So again, did Jesus talk like that?
Yeah.
No, it's incredibly unlikely.
Yeah.
So we have editing, and maybe that editing, by editing, I mean, we have this received tradition of something that Jesus said, and perhaps it was firsthand. Perhaps John or Luke or Matthew or Mark heard him say that. They wrote it down on a notepad, which they didn't have, or they remembered it because they would have had a very robust oral tradition and been very good at remembering things that were said. And then 30 years later or more, they wrote it down or dictated it to someone to write it down.
Yeah.
But it would have been in a different language, so it has to get translated. Is it possible that Jesus said it in this eloquent, beautiful way? It's possible, but it's less likely than that it was edited, it was molded, it was shaped to be memorable for the people that would have been hearing this text being read, because that's how it would have been received, very likely, because it was largely illiterate recipients.
Yeah.
And that's a big deal. This is a very dynamic and fluid situation that we have to wrestle with. It'd be nice if we could receive the Muslim the Muslim tradition that Allah gave Muhammad this, like the words. Yeah. He wrote them down. This is it. There's one source, there's one writer, and we got it. Sweet. Yeah. We don't get that. We have this dynamic, maybe a cacophony of witnesses. They tend to work well together, but it's not clean.
Yeah.
But we work with what we got.
Yeah. And I think something like that we don't understand in the 21st century is how strong an oral tradition there was. And so people probably in many ways had a better memory than we have now to be able to tell a story from heart and tell it well.
Yeah.
And I have a book at home, and I can't remember the title, but it's written by two guys. One of them is a well-known theologian named Greg Boyd. And it's about the historicity of Jesus. And in that book, they spend, I think, most of the introduction just establishing the very, as you said, like the very strong oral tradition that existed and why that's actually very reliable for someone like the gospel author to remember or have it told to him again and then write it down. So oral tradition, like we hear that and be like, oh, you're just telling a story? Like how reliable is that? Well, when it's been passed down for generations and generations, and that's the way 99% of the people communicated and passed down their history, like it's reliable.
And we don't know how that sausage was made.
Yeah.
To turn a phrase. We don't know. Like this, I would expect that the gospel writers, whoever they were, took this very seriously. It was not flippantly done.
No.
It probably involved interviews, some form or fashion of interviews. It obviously involved the personal experiences of the authors, or if they were dictating it, the transcribers relying on those firsthand accounts. No, like Mark wasn't a disciple. He wasn't a disciple. So so was he just following them around? Or does he go around and conduct extensive interviews of all these individuals, figure out which stories matched up nicely, figured out which ones on those details don't make sense, and then wrote down, like, this is what we have to work with. And I don't remember the point of that little tirade, but
well, what it makes me think of too is like if Mark's is the earliest gospel, and then Matthew and Luke, they're like basing what they wrote off of him. They're going through that same editing process, right? And like one of the things from what I understand is that Matthew and Luke do is they like when you read Mark, you get an image of Jesus that is quite different in some ways from what you see in Matthew and Luke. And it maybe that's because Matthew and Luke are, and I don't say this in like, this is not a negative use of the phrase, but trying to finesse the image presented of Jesus as like this, like in this long lineage of going back all the way to Moses. And Mark sometimes is kind of just like a little bit cryptic or like, just or quicker and just like, this is what it is. And not a lot as much explanation. And so Matthew and Luke are like, well, we're gonna, yeah, that's important, but maybe we add this because we've heard it from here. Or
so all this to say, editors, our editors, we really hope most of this doesn't make it in.
No, it has to.
Here's an exercise in editing for you, and perhaps we can recognize the difficulty in using some of this material that has nothing to do with St. Matthew, but maybe everything to do with St. Matthew.
It's staying in.
This is where you say, if you want to hear the rest of the interview, join our Patreon for $3 a month.
Patreon.
Where you get exclusive bonus access.
Yeah. All proceeds going to St. Matthew's, not us personally.
Yeah.
Very important distinction. So, question 2.